Hey everyone, I wanted to do a video where I just answer all the questions from Saturday's live chats that I did not get to in those live chats due to time. I'm very grateful for the support that has come from you guys and the interest shown in those. And more questions get asked than I can get to. So I've tried to go back and I went through the live chat streams and winnowed out all the questions that I did not get to. I'm going to get to those in just a minute. I wanted to share three things first that are just kind of, one of them is a little troubling for me, personally, something I'm dealing with right now. Behind me is that Mike Landau DeVille. And as it came in, it had only two of the 8 speaker screws remaining. They were loose. The speakers were all messed up. So it's got new ET65s. All the other damage to the amp has been undone. A PIM nut that was loose up here is epoxied in place. Got to wait for that epoxy to cure. But the vendor I got all the screws from, and it's a good vendor that I use a lot, only sent 4 of the 8 speaker screws I ordered. So it's going to be another 3-4 days before they get here. It happens. It always happens when I want something done and gone home. So there are a lot of things like that behind the scenes with this whole business where people are like, is my amp ready yet? Is my amp ready yet? And, and I normally would have said, hey, your amp will probably be done tomorrow afternoon or the day after because I'm waiting for that epoxy to cure. But, now we have the vagaries of shipping 4 screws. And yes, I could go to the hardware store and get 4 screws that would work, but the exact length is a little bit tricky, even at a good hardware store, and the black oxides, etc. So I already paid for them. I'm going to get them. The second thing, which is kind of troublesome to me, is this is my 1999 or 2000, I don't recall now, Southern Jumbo. It's the guitar I've had the longest. I love it, love it, love it. A long time ago, I had a bone bridge, bone saddle and nut made for this, and it's a very nicely intonated bone saddle, and for decades now, it's been great. The intonation with the same gauge of strings has been more or less spot on. I put on some strings last night, and I have not restrung it in a few months because I've been so busy with all the electric stuff, and the A string is gone really sharp. I don't know whether this is a bum string in this set. The E's a little sharp. The D's a little sharp. The low E's okay. The D and the G are okay. The B's okay. But that A is just crazy sharp, which makes chords real sour. So I don't know whether I've got a set of strings with a bum A string, it happens, or my concern, given the change in the weather lately, this top has been bellied for a number of years, and my concern is if the belly has risen some more, that's going to throw all the geometry off. The action is still quite nice, maybe a little bit high up here. It's fine down here, and the relief is where I left it. So I'm not panicking yet, but this is a concern. Concurrently with that, which is more problematic for me, is I've been having really bad shooting pains right in here, exacerbated by bar chords. And I've been doing bar chords for 30 plus years. Once you get through the first year and a half, it's not really a problem. And that just is killing me from this knuckle to here. It's just a shooting pain. And that's very worrisome. I don't want to have hand problems, both because I still enjoy playing and I have a need for these hands, and I use my hands for work. I literally do manual labor. On the electric, it's there, but nowhere near I felt it a little bit there on that F sharp. It's really an F. This thing's detuned half step, but it's less severe. So I'm wondering if maybe I should go to the next light gauge strings on the acoustic. Those are 12 to 54. Maybe I'll go to 11 to 50 something, whatever. So just anyway, go to 11s instead of 12s. It's not like I'm playing it on stage with the damn thing, and if I'm not projecting as much as it might have used to, so be it. Anyway, that's what's up with me in my world of getting screwed over, and this, which is problematic in the long term, possibly. Anyway, let me get to those questions now. You've been very patient. So, not all of them are going to have the answers that you might want, and I'll try not to go on at too much length answering the others, but let's get started. And to anyone whose name I mispronounce, I am sorry in advance. Jonathan Shop or Shep asked, what are your thoughts on getting a guitar plecked? And might we ever see something like a machine that essentially plecks an amp? Plecking is good. Plecking is fine. Plecking does not replace a good guitar tech or luthier, but one who has access to a pleck machine can have a lot of the work kind of done for them. But I think a little bit too much is made of that. It's mostly these days a way of getting a little more consistency out of a factory guitar. A great tech does not need a pleck machine. A great tech can make use of one, but a pleck machine will not make a guitar necessarily as great as someone with knowledge and experience. I don't think that there's any correlation to amps, though. Victor, 86HM says, hi. You said Weber's speakers are now inconsistent. Sad, but true. How can you tell you got a bad one, and who makes a good equivalent of the Alnico Silver Bell? The bad ones, when I've had them, have lasted about 4 or 5 months before they blow. I'm talking not a 30-watt speaker and a 30-watt amp, but a 30-watt speaker and a 15-watt amp blows within 4 or 5 months. Or some of them have had voice coil issues. It's not that many. Odds are if you order one, you'll get a good one. But when I order speakers for things, due to the number of speakers I order a year, I get a larger percentage. So if 10% of the speakers have problems, that can be 20, 30 speakers a year that I encounter. It's not the case because if I start getting a bunch of problems with the speakers, I stop using that vendor or that brand as much as possible. But as an individual, you're probably okay if you were to get a Weber. They have a good return policy. They're nice people. I have no problem with them, but I just have found that since Ted passed, the speakers are not as consistently reliable as they used to be. I don't know of anything on the market, aside from a vintage one that's been reconed, that is a good equivalent of the Alnico Silver Bell. So if you want that sound, try it. Just, try to stress it out as much as it's going to get stressed out in a reasonable fashion while it's still under warranty and you have a return period. Thomas Schwartz says hello from southern Germany. Guten Nacht. He says, big fan. He's already learned so much from my vids. I must have included this just copying and pasting. It's not really a question, but thank you, Thomas. David S. asked, have I ever played an all rosewood neck? Yeah, I've played a couple of PRS McCartys that have them. It's an interesting feel. Sounds like a good guitar. I don't know that it's a price worth paying for most people, but there's nothing wrong with it, and it's quite lovely. Lawrence Cash AK asked, the Bassman amp, I think, was rated at 50 watts. The Bassman 70 says 70 watts RMS on the panel. It's two 6L6Gs, push by two 7025s and one 12AT7s. AT7. Can it be easily backdated? I think he's asking if it can be made to the earlier spec. The Bassman 70 is an ultralinear, which means that it has 2 taps per side of the output transformer, the primary and the screen connection on either side. as opposed to just having a primary connection and then there's a separate screen supply. You can use an ultralinear transformer in a basement, or et cetera, and just not use that screen tap and give it a standard screen supply, at which point it will behave like a non-ultralinear fender. So yeah, you can do that. There's some other things though. There's so many different models of amp called the Bassman, and the Bassman 70 is not at all like the Bassman AB 165, let alone the 59, the 5F6A. So know what you're really wanting. Nick Burnsworth asks or says, I have a Hot Rod DeVille that I did the full Fromel mod kit on. It worked great for a year. Then all of a sudden, the more gain channel started running at full volume. Any ideas where to look? Yeah, they have relays that do the channel changing, both from clean to drive, and then more gain, which switches master volumes, et cetera. If the low voltage supply is messed up, all the 5-watt components that I've mentioned previously in videos, the 470 ohm resistors, the 5-watt Zener diodes, 1.2K or 820 ohm, depending on the model, that's over at the very top left end of the board by the indicator bulb, is a 2-watt. Once those burn the board, you're going to get intermittent switching or switching, which is always fixed in one position. So the Fromel mods, I'm not going to say good or bad, but they're pretty irrelevant as to making the amp have a long-term reliability. Changing those components in the low voltage supply are crucial, and I think that's what you found out. It may be time to take your amp to a tech. Core Caulk asks, does the orientation of film caps matter? Outer foil orientation? It can in certain stages of certain circuits. It does not always matter. If you know the outer foil orientation of a film cap, it is good practice to put it to the side of lowest impedance, and that can be ground or that can be B+. If you look at a Fender from 1965, 1966, those blue molded Ajax caps are, you can see the band for the outer foil, and Fender observed the polarity correctly on those. Later in the CBS era, they start to neglect that or even get it consistently backwards, where they have the outer foil end to the wrong side. Those amps can still sound great because it's really not as crucial in a Fender circuit. In some higher gain things, the ability of one component to suppress noise or not be an antenna for noise in its environment can be cumulatively important. So it's a best practice kind of thing, but in 95% of amps out there, you're not going to notice a downside to not doing it. I know that's vague, and I know that sounds like I'm avoiding giving you the real juicy things. In any amp that I build, if I have access, if I know where the outer foil is, I put it specifically for that. It's best practice. In any amp that I build, I put the resistor bands all in the same orientation, not because it makes any difference, that's just paint, but it shows that I'm paying attention as I place each component. Best practice can be a good thing, even if there's not an immediate tangible result from that. Sergeant Grinch asks, I have a 12-year-old grandson starting guitar for his 13th birthday. Congratulations. What would I suggest for an amp? He really likes the SG guitar. Well, if he already has the SG, then an amp makes sense. My advice for most people, when someone wants to play guitar, is get them an acoustic. They'll learn more. I know that's sounds like an old fuddy-duddy thing to say, but an acoustic guitar, I think, is the better place to start. That's me. If I were in that same situation, and I have been, I would suggest buying as a fairly inexpensive but good sounding little amp, just in case they don't end up playing and you've not spent a ton of money. People complain about amps being so expensive these days. We actually live in a golden era where you can get amazing things for very little money. You know, $250 these days will get you a 50-watt Boss Katana, which would certainly be a fantastic amp for a beginner. You can get all these different sounds, and from the people around the beginner's perspective, they can hear them listen in headphones, so you don't have to hear all the mistakes. And they can sound like they're heroes out of the gate, which, an acoustic guitar doesn't give that immediate gratification. When I look back at the amps that I started out with, the Gorillas and such, and then I graduated to a Fender Stage 85, adjusting for inflation. That Gorilla costs more than a 50-watt Katana these days, and there wasn't a good sound to be had in it. I would avoid the tiny little things, and I would avoid all the Harley Benton and Chinese imports of various dubious distinctions. Go with a brand that you can trust to some degree, but anything at that price range, $200, $300, know that it's not going to be a long-term proposition. But if you happen to have an old Vibrochamp sitting around, let them use the Vibrochamp and just get them some pedals. Joe Dinsmore says, "Hey, Lyle." "Hey, Joe. I've got a PV5153 that seems to have some static/noise that is not 60 cycle hum. I have replaced the power tubes as well as 2 preamp tubes. That did not help much. Any suggestions?" Yeah, 5150s have noise. The preamp tubes, there are 5 of them, I believe. 6, I think, on some later ones. That can, so any one of those can cause issues. The tube sockets can get dirty. That can cause issues. The pots can get dirty. That can cause issues. The effects loop jack, the contacts can get dirty. That's extremely common in those models. So the first thing to try is just putting a short cable from the send jack to the return jack and see if your problem goes away. If so, you need some contact cleaner on those jacks. But don't expect miracles from those amps. You can also have noise caused by bad plate resistors. It happens. The beginnings of a failed filter cap. It happens. But before you borrow trouble, I'd spend time thinking about things like cleaning the pots, make sure the hardware is tight, and the send and return jack contacts are clean. Derek Wyman says, I have a Max 18 Junior. I think he means a Maz 18 Junior. Sorry, I know typos are real. I have them myself. But if I'm going to talk about the Maz, if there is a Max 18 Junior with which I'm familiar, I apologize. That sounds great, but since new has burned through tubes, any suggestions or mods to make it more tube friendly? The Maz 18s that I've had in, the bias has been pretty reasonable, but it has 100 ohm screen grid resistors, at least the ones I've had in. So I would have a tech increase. Actually, it doesn't have 100 ohm screen grid resistors. It's got a great big honking shared screen resistor, which should be fine. The Maz 18 Junior typically doesn't have problems burning tubes with hot bias, and the screens are fine. You can add individual screen protection. I've done that. I would make sure that the jacks, especially the output jacks and the input jack, are tight. Beyond that, you really need to take it to a tech, and I can't speculate without having the amp in front of me. They're good amps. They're not fun to work on, but inherently, that should not be burning up tubes. Travis McCartney asks, what wattage should I use for the heater balance resistors on a Fender Princeton when I pull the quick connects off the board? I use 1/2 watt carbon films because if I use 1 watts, they may not burn in case of a heater to something else short, heater to ground, heater to plate. the half watts will burn, and I want that. They're going to sacrifice themselves to protect the power transformer. Essentially, they're going to be acting as fuses if there's a real fault, but they won't have false failures like most fuses on heater supplies give. If I elevate them, I mount them to the octal sockets elevated off the socket and not touching anything else. So if they burn, they burn. If that bothers you or you worry about fire, you can use a flame-proof metal oxide, but I would still use half watt. You want the damn thing to give out if there's a short to protect your power transformer. But they do sell flame proofs. Just fewer people have access or are willing to go through Mauser and DigiKey to order those. And most people who sell parts for amps, for tube amps, don't carry that or stock that flame proof part. So you can use a half watt carbon film, not a carbon comp. You can use a metal film as long as it's half watt. I just use a lot of 100 ohm carbon film half watts in my business, so that's what I reach for. All right, let's see here. H. Hydrick says, "Hey Lyle, thanks for your videos. Hey H. Hydrick, on a 50 watt EVH 5153, I think he's saying, what do you think about changing the 12X7s in positions V1, V2, V3, V4 to 5751 to reduce the hissing noise on the red channel?" It will reduce it. It will not eliminate it. The resistors that they use, the circuit layout, where all the places the signal is routed to, makes that a noisy, hissy channel. You can reduce to 5751. You can buy tubes rated, pre-selected for low noise and microphonics. You can do all kinds of things. But the 5150 and the dual rectifier are the two amps which pretty much invented the noise gate market for that reason. 32 Hertz says, "Hey, can one install shielded cables for internal connections inside the amp chassis to prevent hum? Would it be worth the extra hassle with all the ground connections, etc.?" I'm making sure this is still being recorded. Yeah, you can. I do it all the time. It's not really to prevent hum so much as to prevent interference from adjacent circuitry, and it does keep a noise floor lower. It's not just hum, it's buzz and white noise. With all the ground connections. Well, the trick there is you want to do a telescoped shield where the ground's only connected at one end, and not everything needs to be shielded. Typically connections to grids of tubes or any other low AC signal carrying wires. It gets really in the weeds there, but I see amps where every single wire has been shielded. There's not really a downside to it other than it makes it really difficult and time consuming and expensive to build and then later to service. But typically the only things that need to be shielded are grid connections, which is all AC, relatively low signal. There's some capacitance issues that come up too, but that gets too far in the weeds. All right, Thomas Schwartz asks, "Have you worked on a PI, a phase inverter, balance control like the Tweedledee 53 has?" I think it means 5E3. "Would there be any problem running a push-pull power section on one tube only with half the signal shunted to ground, so single-ended and push-pull switched?" I guess he's asking. I have worked on a PI balance control. It can be kind of cool. I think a little too much is made of it in the forums when people get excited figuring out new things that they can do. You can also just temp in a pot and say, "Oh, I really like the sound of this," and then try a different tube. And if you still like that ratio, try. You can dial in the magic with a pot, and then the tube changes and the magic's not there anymore. But you may say, okay, instead of if you're doing the on the balance control on the 5E3, talking about the cathode, you can say, all right, I like the instead of 1.5K, 10K, or actually 56K, I like 2.3K and whatever the rest is, 48K. And I like that balance all the time, no matter what tube I put in there. You can just put in a fixed resistor and skip the pot. Pots fail more often than resistors. I know I'm going on at length about that. More importantly, on your question, it'd be very rare for you to have an output transformer that would allow you to do either push-pull or single-ended on the same amp, because the single-ended output transformer does not work at all the same way as a push-pull output transformer. If there are some out there that switch, I'm not immediately aware of them. But everyone who does this thinks, oh, that'd be cool. I'll just turn off one side of the output, and then I got single-ended. And no, it doesn't work that way. Sorry, we all figure that out, much to our disappointment. Steve Lark. Now, here's a question that I thought I'd answered on Saturday, but looking back, I had missed some subsequent information Steve gave. So, Steve, on the subject, I'm going to read the question for everyone. Using my reverb foot switch with my Princeton reverb causes lots of static. Foot switch is wired and shielded correctly. Is noise just inherent for the foot switch, or can you recommend a fix? The foot switch on a traditional Fender reverb circuit, including the Princeton reissue, is shunting the grid on the reverb return to ground. And that foot switch is putting a signal wire from the grid of that tube 15, 20 feet out to the foot switch pedal. And any noise, if the reverb is not switched off, if the reverb is not off, then it's not at ground. So any noise that gets introduced to that 15-foot 20 cable being hung out in space gets amplified and mixed in. So you can think everything's fine as far as a meter, but you could have a break in the shielding. You could have it running over a power cable, an AC cable, in parallel for 5 feet of the run and not realize it, and just be injecting noise in there. You could have a bad cable. You could have a bad shield in the foot switch itself. It could be external lights, like a Coors Light sign on the stage. It could be all kinds of things. It can also just be dirty contacts on the foot switch jack, or that jack is not tight to chassis. So while you measure tip to sleeve, everything's fine, the sleeve of that jack is not actually fully contacting the chassis. So maybe that'll help you track it down. Gringo Pig asked or says, I just bought a Victory VC35, which is an EL84 Vox style amp. He likes it. Any experience with Victory? I've had 3 or 4, something 40, and a Duchess, and I don't remember the others. They were all fine. I'm not a huge fan of lunchbox amps because everything is crammed together and the heat has nowhere to go. That said, they're infinitely better built than the Vox lunchboxes like the Night Train series. I don't have any warning for them more specific than I give out in my Amps Under $1,000 video, where things will go wrong and the repair can be expensive. And I'm not sure how much the cramped space of everything will exacerbate the chance of failure. Time will tell, but they do sound quite nice. Analog Neil says, oh wait, I almost missed one. Ian Miller, sorry, which of the Princeton 65 blackface or 68 reissue silverface do I prefer, and why? The 65, because the 68 is a noisy, humming, hissy marketing move, just to have something else on the market and, hey, this one's got more gain. You don't need it. It's almost every 68 custom Fender that comes in is someone wanting me to make it less noisy, and step one of that is making it back to the 65 circuit, which was a better circuit. All right, now, Analog Neil. Great channel. Thank you, Neil. Great name. Been looking for a schematic for an early Alamo Fury amp for years to no avail. An all-tube model, not the later one with the transistor and the preamp. Any experience with one? I've had 1 or 2, I've had 3 Alamos in it, I think. I will no longer work on an Alamo tube amp because it is not worth the investment. I will say that they're very simple things, and you probably don't need to find a schematic. You could figure it out yourself or find a tech buddy to take a look at it. The last ones I had in, I drew out the schematic in like 5 minutes. It was, okay, they're doing that one. Yeah. We got a number 7 here, guys. No big deal. There's nothing really innovative or unusual in those. But the problem I had, which is why I don't want to take them in anymore, is the last one. The guy said, oh man, I love this amp. I love this amp. It's my main amp. It's my sound. I love it. I love it. And I said, are you sure you want me to spin this? Because it needs all new caps. It needs a new power cable. Your speaker's shot. It's got cabinet repair issues. Half the pots need to be changed. And, you know, he loved a terrible sounding thing. And he says, yeah, man. I'm like, well, are you sure? It's got to be like $300-$400. Are you sure you want me to do this? And he said, absolutely. Well, I did it, and it came to like $425 with parts and tax. And for a couple of weeks, he would tell the music store, yeah, man, I'll be in tomorrow to get it. Yeah, I'll be in tomorrow to get it. And then he just stopped answering the phone when they called, and it sat there for a year. And he'd authorized all this work. I think the store eventually sold it for $400 to someone else. And so when you have an amp that's upside down like that, market value versus the cost it would take to really make it good, you know, if the owner doesn't come through on their end, then you can't get your money back very much. I mean, the music store and I just squeaked out on that one. And that's a bad place to be, and I don't want to be there again. So if you have one and you want to put your own time into it, it's a pretty easy circuit, but it was not there's a reason Alamo did not last long. There's a reason people don't say, hey, remember that Led Zeppelin album that had the Alamo? No one remembers the Alamo. Sorry, Texas. Clyde Broadway, hey again, what do you touch inside an amp that will kill you? That's a question that I almost did not include in this. I'll tell you why. It's a dangerous question because if I tell you what inside an amp will kill you, that implies that there are other things in the amp that are safe. And I don't want to put that out there, that partial information on the internet, or someone says, oh, it's safe to touch this or it's safe to touch that, because they may think that the thing they're touching is the thing that I said was safe, but it's really the thing that if I was standing there with them, I'm like, are you crazy? That's the thing I told you never to touch. If these are the questions you have to ask, don't touch anything inside an amp. And if you want to learn the answer to that, really, go buy a bunch of books and build a bunch of pedals and then build some amps. And, you know, it takes time to know what to and not to touch. And I know that in my standard videos, you'll see me, my hands will be close to things. I'll touch things, or I'll use some people are like, oh my God, he used a metal screwdriver. Well, yeah, I was touching a ground point. So do as I say, not as you may think that I do. But I'm still here and I'm fine. I'm obviously taking my own advice, even if it doesn't always look like it to you. And also the camera doesn't always give you great depth perception. So I may be 3 inches away from something, it looks like I'm touching it. So don't take that from my videos. And don't take, this will kill you inside an amp, this is okay to touch. Take, if you have to ask, don't touch anything, please. They will kill you. It's not being hyperbolic. Screaming Corpse Lord. All right, we got a username winner here, guys. Screaming Corpse Lord says hi. So Screaming Corpse Lord is very polite. Bet you didn't expect that. I have a 72 Trainer YBA1, cool, that I love, but half the time sound guys get irritated by its volume. Yeah, they will. I run it jumpering the channels. Would you recommend installing a post-phase inverter master volume or an attenuator? I would recommend 2 things. I would recommend replacing the linear taper audio, linear taper volumes with audio taper volumes, so it doesn't go from nothing to, oh my God, that's loud, instantly. It'll also give you better control over your jumpering. And yeah, a post-phase inverter master volume, the Larmar that people install in Marshalls all the time, works perfectly in that amp. I've done it on a couple dozen bass masters at this point. Phenomenal amps, but you cannot play them in any stage in the city that's indoors unless you have that master volume. and you can't even be in the room with it with the stock linear taper pot. Also, the bright cap on that thing is really harsh. You might want to consider backing that bright cap on the volume pot down quite a bit. Jeffrey Birchfield. Jeffrey, I'm sorry. You, like me, have a much more boring screen name than Screaming Corpse Lord. All right, Jeffrey Birchfield asks, have you and will you work on Alessandro hand-wired amps? What are your thoughts on these? I have a Fender Twin by Alessandro, and the volume doesn't work until it gets above 3.5. I have not worked on, I'd be willing to work on, but have not worked on any Alessandro hand-wired amps. I have heard good things about them. I've seen some pictures. I'm reserving judgment until I actually have one on the bench. But when it comes to the volume not working until it gets above 3.5 on a Twin, I'm going to say that Alessandro is probably not at fault. I still think it's regrettable, but he's not at fault. They're probably trying to use a very high quality volume pot for that. So they got a CTS 1 meg audio taper pot. And the CTS 1 meg and 500K audio taper pots in the last couple of years have had a real problem where the lower range of the pot, there's just nothing. So it goes from no volume, no volume, no volume. Oh, it's on. So there's no gradual taper off. It's like nothing, nothing, nothing. And then you hit 3.5, and it's on. It's kind of loud. There are three solutions for that. You can use a Burns or a PEC. I find that the better two options are either to use an Alpha 1 meg audio, which is much smoother. It is not perceived by most people to be as good as the CTS because it costs $1.50 versus costing $5. But in practice, it is a equivalent quality pot in my experience and has a much nicer taper. Or you can go the other way and get either a CTS or Fender branded made by CTS. And I prefer the Fender because of the bushing length, 1 meg J taper pot, which is a 30% taper versus 10%. And that's the volume taper that you would actually find in a Fender from the 60s. And that has a much nicer gradual control over the lowest. So I don't think Alessandro screwed you over or really did anything wrong. I think, like many of us, they've just encountered that the CTS 1 meg audio taper pots just cut out. And maybe they didn't think that would be a problem because people aren't going to play it on one. But you should be able to. So I would give Alessandro a minor pass on that. But at the same time, when you spend that much money for an amp, it's nice to have everything just so. Sam Strobin says, I had a Victoria 5E3 clone and a Princeton reissue. I'm keeping the Princeton. I do alternative rock rhythm guitar. It just depends on the amp guy genre. Victoria was farty when overdriven. Well, the Victoria was farty when overdriven because the 5E3, if you go back and buy a 57, 58, 59 Tweed Deluxe worth $5,000 these days, they're farty when overdriven. The coupling caps are really large. The cathodiene phase inverter has got grid blocking distortion and all kinds of minor issues. Fender never expected you to play it dirty, and it sounds kind of nasty dirty, and some guys love it. Neil Young has built an entire career on it. So yeah, it's purely subjective, but I want you to know that when your Victoria, from your opinion, sucked, your Victoria sucked exactly like a vintage amp. So well played, Victoria. Rockin' Vita says, Lyle, as us aging baby boomers, first of all, no offense to you, I am not a baby boomer. I'm Gen X. People forget about us these days. But as us aging baby boomers, you guys start to retire from live performance and or start selling off guitars and amps, where do you see the future going? Well, hopefully the rest of us can start getting some of those cool guitars and amps at a lower price. Because while those of us younger than the baby boomers may want to have a 66 Deluxe Reverb or Super Reverb or a 72 Marshall or a 66 335, etc., we're probably not going to want to do it because Bloomfield had one or Clapton had one or Hendrix used one this one time, this 1 week, and therefore Gibson has a whole tribute model from one photo. So we're not going to be wanting to pay the same premium, but I think we're going to appreciate the instrument for what it really is and why the original person appreciated it. So Clapton didn't play a 64 335 with Cream because God said, let there be Clapton with a 64 335 with Cream. He played it. He liked it. It sounded good to him. He played it. It was a good guitar. It's still a good guitar. But the trouble is so many baby boomers, and I mean this kindly, idolize that man and fetishize that one red guitar from that one concert. And so the price, that whole marketing, the price market is crazy. Now, all that said, a lot of those guitars are in bank vaults in Japan and Switzerland and stuff, and no one's ever going to see them again. P.W. LeBrun had a very nice compliment. He made a donation because, I'm using his words, you embody what everyone dreamed the interwebs would be, amazing information and learning opportunities, freely shared. Thank you, P.W. That's very kind. I do try to be a little more on the information, a little less on the let me entertain you side. Rafiot, hi Lyle, what B plus is too close for a 500 volt cap? Is 490 volts a bit on the risky side, or is it good enough? There are safety margins we want. If the 490 is unloaded, then it goes down to 440. When the tubes are in place, you're probably okay-ish. I would probably be tempted to put in a series cap to handle 600 or 700 volts there. In general, you want at least 20%, optimally 50% margin. That's not always attainable. And there are exceptions. You can say, well, yeah, the voltage will approach the rating, but the current at that time will be so minuscule, and there'll be the temperature will not be a factor. So I think while there are exceptions, you have to know an awful lot to know when those exceptions come into play. And in general, you have to say, well, if the unloaded is 480, but then the loaded is 430, fine. Probably won't hurt anything. If loaded is 490, unloaded is like 540, and you're probably going to have a shorter caps lifetime. So it's a good question, and it's one that amp designers deal with all the time. Good ones do, but the answers can have a lot of variation depending on different conditions and operating states. And I have found that the internet is not always the best place to discuss nuance. William Bach says, can the tremolo circuit tube affect the pilot light? I can't figure out why it would, but I've seen it happen on more than one amp. I have a friend who's seen it too. It wasn't the filament. That would be very unusual unless there was a problem with the heater supply of one of the tubes used in that circuit, which would be drawing the heater down. Now, there are amps, such as the Vox AC30 Custom Classic, that derive the standby light from a B+, which is, in fact, affected by the tremolo. And so it's not unusual on those amps for the standby light, the green light, to pulse in time with the tremolo. I would say that if I had your amp here and I knew what model you're talking about, I could probably say, oh, yeah, that's interesting. That's what's happening here. So many things are possible, but at the same time, people don't always distinguish between causation and correlation. You may have something else causing the tremolo. Maybe the tremolo is triggering something else in the amp, which is causing that indicator light to be affected. Maybe the tremolo is going into something into oscillation, or something's going in and out of oscillation depending on the tremolo, and that's drawing more and more current, and that's affecting the power transformer. I'm speculating, what ifing, but these are also things that most people don't have the tools to measure. So I'm going to have to move on. But take your amp to a tech. A good tech will sort that out and let you know what's going on. Rafiot asks again, what is the recipe to know what kind of primary impedance you need for an output transformer? Well, that's all included in data sheets. If you were to go and say, okay, I'm going to use class A, B, one operation. But for most people who don't know how to read a data sheet, and that's a lot of people working at major companies these days, it seems, you can in general just say, well, what did Fender do? What did Marshall do? I got a pair of 6V6s. What's the primary impedance listed by Haybor and Hammond for their deluxe reverb output transformer? Okay, well, the 5E3 deluxe one is okay, you know, and you can do that and say, all right, well, most people there seem to be using 5 through 8K, and 6.3K seems to be the most common. That's probably safe for a pair of 6V6s. I'll do that. But to know more than that, you really need to study and learn how to read the data sheets. Beefcake Wizard. All right, that's another contender for a great username. I think Screaming Corpse Lord might be beating you out slightly, Beefcake Wizard, but not by much. Do you consider yourself a Renaissance man? Thanks. I appreciate the implied compliment. That's a very nice thing for you to say. I don't, primarily because I don't speak more than one language. While I think I speak English very well, and I have a smattering of French, and I have a smattering of Spanish, and I can kind of read Italian as a result, and I got by in Portugal as a result. I only speak one language. I don't have any knowledge of mathematics really beyond algebra, no calculus, don't remember any trig. I don't have a knowledge of advanced physics these days. I'm interested. I'd like to. I think it might be, if this doesn't sound awful, it might have been easier to be a Renaissance man during the Enlightenment, say Thomas Jefferson, etc. Because aside from the language thing, those guys did know French and Latin and German, and there was a lot less science to know. You did not have to know calculus. It was barely invented. You did not have to know much about geography. We didn't know where most things were yet. Geology was in its infancy. Archaeology was in its infancy. Plate tectonics had not been discovered, let alone what we think of today as physics. I mean, they had just figured out gravity. So there was less to learn. I think it was easier to be a Renaissance man then. And I watch shows set in the future, Star Trek or Star Wars. And my God, the average person knows how to fix a space fighter or knows how to repair a droid, but you never see them reading. It's very odd. Kevin says, all my amps are a British style, and I want to try something American. Any thoughts on the Hot Rod DeVille 2x12? Some people have said to stay away. Well, Kevin, those some people are correct. Stay away from the Hot Rod, stay away from the Blues, stay away from the Blues Junior. These are horrible, horrible investments. They catch on fire. I've shown this repeatedly on my channel. For the same price as the Hot Rod DeVille, you could get a deluxe reverb reissue. Still needs a little bit of work to make it last long term, but you won't get a more American sounding amp, and it's a better use of your money. And there are many, many variations, other brands doing comparable things. But if you take nothing else away from it, take away that you do not want the Hot Rod DeVille. You do not want the Blues DeVille. You do not want the Blues Junior. They're terrible. I'm sorry. I have to be honest about that. BB Made, do you see a future with a lack of qualified amp techs? Yes, but at the same time, I see that same future, fewer amp techs will be necessary. I mean, I have to be honest about how the world is trending. And the digital stuff is getting better and better every year, every decade. Now, 20 years from now, it may be that digital is just so good that there's just no reason to have all these devices, except for those of us who just like the beauty of them. And I'm afraid that most of that digital stuff will be non-repairable, but maybe the world will get its collective head out of its collective butt a little bit and stop designing all electronics to be landfill. Hey, you just change out this chip and then it's a whole new device, and the case stays the same. We'll see if we get there. Some would say we already have a lack of qualified amp techs compared to 30 years ago. I certainly know that what I do is now a very esoteric field that until the 70s and 80s, many other industries used tubes, and tube technology was still taught in electronics schools. So yeah, it is already fewer qualified technicians than there used to be. And that will continue to be the case as time goes on, but there are going to be alternatives. It's kind of a shame thinking about all that every year several 100,000 more Blues Juniors are made, and they're all shipped out with tubes. And so those tubes, which are going to be some of the last tubes ever made, are wasted on Blues Juniors, which just kill those tubes and end up in landfills eventually, rather than the tubes being saved for something that could still be played 20, 30 years from now. I don't mean to sound dark and depressing, but you have to have clear vision on that kind of thing. Razor Days asks, what is normal voltage across an output transformer primary for 5-watt SE amps, single-ended amps like a Champ? Got one I built that has 30 volts across the primary, and it causes the screen to be higher than the plate voltage. Well, I don't know how you're measuring that. If you're measuring that at idle, and whether it truly is at idle with no signal, or whether you might have some kind of oscillation. I don't have schematics for, say, a Champ in front of me right now to remember. I don't think 30 volts drop is at all normal, but I don't recall what normal is. I will say, though, and I could be wrong on that, I could be misremembering, but I will say that it is not unusual for single-ended amps like that to have the screen voltage at idle be higher than the plate voltage, and it's not necessarily something to worry about. I may follow this up in the comments after I consult some schematics, just in case I'm misremembering something. Jeff Harper says he's curious, what is your opinion of the Vox AC30 S1? I've not had one in. I believe that they're doing similar things to that as they do on the AC10 custom with the MOSFET chips, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The way that it's done in the AC10 C1 is problematic because they're following a fine MOSFET LND 150 application with a op-amp loop and reverb that's only got a plus 5 volt supply, so it kills all the headroom. But until I get an S1 in, I don't really have an opinion other than knowing that they're not quite made as 2B as the AC15 and AC30 C2. 2B or not 2B? That is the question. Metart93, have you worked on any 2-rocks? Do you think they live up? Do you think they live up to the hype and price point? I've worked on 2 or 3. I keep out of the hype thing. I don't even know what the price point is. They were well built. They used Illinois caps, which was initially worrisome, but they seem to be fine. Illinois cap is a subsidiary of CDM, which is one of the largest and best cap manufacturers. And Illinois makes different caps in their series to different price points. And just because Fender gets the cheapest ones possible does not mean that every gray cap automatically is bad. There's some hand wiring going on in there, so it can be an expensive thing. I don't know what the price point is. I don't follow that. And, hype, everything gets hyped for a while, and then people move on and hype something else. So you watch all the forums. But the T-Rocks I've had and played, it's a Fender Dumble thing. It sounds like a Fender Dumble thing. I had no problem with them. I thought some of the bright switching options were crazy bright, but so are those of a real Dumble. Ken Nieminsky asks, are 130 watts worth of speakers enough for an 85 watt amp? Yes. You really want to have about 20-30% minimum more than the stated wattage. So 85, go 20, 30, 100 to 110. Put it this way. I've got 130 watts handling on my shop cab, and I run loud Fender Twins into it all the time for test purposes. No issues there. Prometheus 2.0. All right, that's a good username too. I know you have a disdain for Mesas. What are your thoughts on the Mesa California Tweed? Well, I have a disdain, and it has a tan. They can come out with a new model tomorrow, and odds are it's going to be this variation on the same bad junk they've always fobbed off on a gullible public. So someone's going to be furiously typing right now. Just remember that negative, angry thoughts help my channel too. Kevin Farrell says, played a theater show last night and got serious hum, no hum usually, using FX board straight to input. Put through send return loop and the hum went away. Any simple reason I could look at? If I understand this, you had your guitar through your FX pedals into the front of an amp and you had hum. And then you went guitar into your amp input and then put all your effects pedals in the send return loop and you did not have any hum. You could have a bad ground in one of your guitar cables, and using the effects loop with send and return, you could have the ground not connected on one of those cables, and it's fine because that would just be a telescope ground and it'd still be a ground path through the effects loop jacks. Whereas the first time when you were using, you needed the shielding on the cable to also be the signal negative. If there was any disconnection there, you'd have a terrible hum using it there. So that's what I would think was probably happening, or is a very likely thing. But that's the kind of thing when people call a tech, I'm like, I'll bring it all here, every part of your thing, because there are problems that will only show up in certain combinations, and this sounds like that kind of thing. But beyond that, I'd have to speculate. Steve Lark says, it seems ambiguous when Fender went from GZ34 to 5U4 in late 60s amps. I bought a super reverb chassis with no cab. How would you figure this out? Thanks. Well, that's really easy. While they changed from the GZ34 to the 5U4, they never changed the power transformer. So any Fender which uses a 5U4 could also use a GZ34, and vice versa. It's really just going to affect the B plus level, and as a result, you bias for that tube. So if you're comfortable setting the bias, you can use either tube, setting the bias, playing it for a while, and see if you have a preference between the two. I think a lot is made of the difference between a GZ34 and a 5U4, but especially in the late 60s Fenders, it's not the same dramatic difference you might get in, say, a 59 basement or low-power twin. Johnny Chacon, if I wanted to get a pristine, clean tone without getting any breakup on a Fender Blues Junior, what would you recommend? Well, that's not the amp that I would go to for a pristine, clean tone with no breakup, but I would get a very clean, efficient speaker, at least rated for at least twice the output of the amp, so 65, 70 watt speaker in that range. I would maybe use a 5751 for the first tube, maybe even an AT7 for the phase inverter. I would definitely follow the advice in my own videos on lowering the bias point of the amp, so the EL84s will be operating in a much nicer, healthier part of their swing. And use a Strat, not a Les Paul. You use 6K single coils, not 15K humbuckers. And then watch your pick attack. And last for this one, Jeremy Green says, I have a 1984 50-watt JCM 800, and about 75% of the tubes I put in V1 seem to buzz. I've tried new old stock and many reissue tubes. With luck on some, the amp is basically stock except the filter caps and tubes. Well, the good news, Jeremy, is that you're not inventing things, and you're not alone. The bad news is you're going to have to do something about it. Many 80s, 2203s, 2204s have hum, real bad hum, injected into V1A, the unbypassed 10K cathode. It is just telling all the heater voltage, come in here. This is where you come in. You have an unbypassed 10K cathode resistor there. And it does not happen with, or very rarely happens with, old tubes. I'm not talking, it doesn't have to be 63, but 83. Tubes used to be made to a much better spec, including when this amp was designed. And if you're talking about 2204 50 watt from 1984, aside from some changes they made in 83, that's still the 1976-ish design. So they got away with it for a long time because the tubes they were using in the 70s and 80s did not have this problem. But as you've discovered, most modern tubes do. And so the fix is one of two things. And people are going to say you can just tightly twist the heaters. That's rarely the case. Move the heaters away from the grids. Sometimes that helps, and that's a good thing to do for all of these amps. And I'll do that as a matter of course, is move the grids as far away from the red and black wires as possible, especially that little loop that comes over to pin 9. But the real fix I have found is to do one of the following two options. Number one, you can have a tech install an actual honest-to-God DC heater supply for V1. And you can probably do V1 and V2 if you do that. If you're going to spend that money, spend it a little bit more and get the current for that. And that's usually adding a transformer if you want to do it right. It's not that big a deal, but it does involve some modification of the amp. A good tech can do that. But the other thing a tech can do, and I've done this in a similar model, and I've got a video up on the channel where I show that, I think 78, 79, somewhere in that era. You can also just do an elevated DC reference for the heater supply. And what that means is you want to create a DC point about 50 volts, and you reference the heater, either the center tap or the heater supply to that, or preferably an artificial center tap to that. And Friedman does that using the screen node, a half voltage supply in his amps. And I've done that both when designing amps and as a fix specifically for that issue. And it does fix that issue. And a good tech could say, oh, yeah, I need to create a new DC node. I'll pull it off the phase inverter node because that's already pretty well filtered, and I'll just knock it down with the voltage divider to 50 volts, give it its own filter cap, reference the heater balance resistors to that, and lo and behold, all that hum and buzz goes away. And that or the dedicated DC heater supply are about the only ways I have found to deal with that. But it's really simple and certainly effective. And a lot of, I guess by 84, you wouldn't necessarily have it, but a lot of the older 2204 boards have some extra unused holes at the far end of the board where it's real easy to attach a terminal strip to hold. We're talking 2 resistors and a capacitor. So it's a simple thing to do. You can have it added, and then you can take it out, and you're just attaching it to the old board as opposed to drilling the chassis. but a tech can take care of that. And speaking of taking care of things, I need to get back to a bunch of amps here, including that Blues Junior from the other day, where I got authorization to do all the work, including the new PCB on the output tubes. And I've got the new Vectrols to install in that Mesa. That's going to be a pain in the butt. And I need to order the correct screws that were not shipped with that Mike Landau. And I've got a deluxe reverb to put back in its cabinet. And about a month ago, I had a Blues Junior that we put a Neo Lil Texas, Eminence Neo Lil Texas speaker in. And at the time, I thought this thing has no low end and it's really painfully bright. And now, about a month later, the owner called me today and said, hey, this thing has got no low end and it's really painfully bright. So I'm going to order him a new speaker. So I'm going to get started on all that fun stuff. So thanks for joining me, as always. I always forget to look